Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to speak to you about a Horizon 2020 project which finished earlier on this year called Eureka, Youth Political Participation in a Context of Rising Inequalities, which Howard Williamson was also involved in as an advisor, so apologies to him for the fact he's heard some of this before, but I'm going to try to focus on actually Howard's question of yesterday of what's new, what is new. So some basic factors about the project. It involved 9 countries: France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Poland, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK. It collected lots of data, political claims analysis of media of 4,500 articles between 2011 and 2016. Quantitative analysis of 4,500 youth-related and youth-led organizations through their statutes and their websites, 265 interviews with people about youth organizations, a panel survey analysis of, in total, 27,000 people in the 9 countries, 252 biographical interviews with active young people, and quite innovative social media analysis of discussions about the climate strike and about Me Too and feminism in the 9 countries. And so lots of data, both of a quantitative and to a slightly lesser extent qualitative nature, which, truth be told, are still being analysed now, and lots of the research is still going on. What I'm going to try and do in this quick talk is to bring out some of the what I think interesting results and consider their potential implications for youth work in the view of starting a discussion, really. Of course, I'm going to be quite broad in my suggestions here. There's lots of variation which is hidden under what I'm going to say. But so what is new? Well, I think what is new, and that's the background of the project, is that young people today, and the project's treated anybody under the age of 35 as young, young people are suffering a kind of structural disadvantage in European societies because of the combination of demographic aging of the society and economic recession. And so before the 2008 financial crisis, which turned into an economic crisis, people between the age of 18 and 25 were roughly at the same risk of poverty as people over the age of 65 in Europe. By 2018, young people were at least 10 percentage points more likely to be in poverty than people over the age of 65, and had the lowest median income of any group. And now, perhaps needless to say, we're suffering again a historic recession, and all the indications are that the youngest people starting to work are going to be the people who suffer the most now and also durably in the future. So there's a combination of economic inequality rising overall, combined with demographic aging of the population, and a weak social security system for young people. Our social security systems have been built either to protect the oldest in society or the very youngest, but historically not to protect those starting work, has combined to mean that young people are in a weak position economically, and also in terms of their political participation. They are quite simply outnumbered. And the research showed again and again and again that in terms of the number of invitations to contribute politically, to give opinions politically, to even to go and vote, young people, whether online or offline, were much less solicited than older parts of the population. The politicians know where they're getting their votes from, and it's usually not coming from young people. So what does this mean for youth work? Well, it perhaps means that youth work needs to think about informing young people about the macro causes of their situation. Perhaps we need to think about the political role of the youth sector itself in explaining the overall situation of young people in our societies. And perhaps we need to think about the ways that youth work can prioritize the political participation of young people, for fear that otherwise they're simply ignored. Now, so how in this context are young people spoken about in the media? Well, on the basis of this massive analysis of media articles, young people are far more often spoken about than being able to speak themselves. At least 3/4 of the claims made about young people in the media are made by other actors than young people themselves, whether it be the state, the police, the politicians, trade unions. Only in France did young people manage to speak more often in their own name than other actors amongst the countries that were studied, and that was largely thanks to one newspaper, Libération, which seems to regularly feature the voices of young people. In Germany, youth actors and the state roughly were speaking at about the same frequency about young people. So that shows that in Germany, the youth organizations have managed to claim a certain space. But in general, other actors are speaking much more about youth than youth themselves. And when they talk about youth, they're often talking about other issues. Young people themselves tend to be at least 10% more likely to be making claims about political participation and their impossibility of participating politically. So there's evidence that young people themselves are aware that they have some difficulty in participating. There's furthermore evidence that in countries where state actors are quite negative in their views of youth political participation, and there's evidence that where they're negative, that drives participation down even further. Where state actors are positive about youth political participation, that drives up youth political participation. So some implications for youth work. Well, it suggests supporting media training for young people, perhaps also media training for not young people, but people who talk about youth, to talk about youth in an encouraging way, welcoming also the critical views of youth when they speak about youth in the media, supporting in general a diversified media landscape, and fighting against delegitimization. What I mean by that is young people feeling like because they don't have a voice, they actually don't have a political legitimacy. And this was a theme that came up several times in the research, that there's a danger that young people feel like they don't have the right to speak just because they don't hear voices of people like them very often. And that's for demographic and structural reasons. And so bringing that out to the young people is a way of them understanding that it's not that they don't have the legitimacy, there's just hurdles in their way. So how do young people do politics? There's no great surprises here, but they are of all age groups mostly the ones most involved in protest occupations and petitions, but they're also as involved as the rest of the population in associations and volunteering. There's a general shift coming out from the biographical interviews that were done. There's a kind of shift towards a form of political participation which is about changing your lifestyle and getting personally involved in an issue rather than necessarily just supporting an organization. The young people that were interviewed saw social media as a kind of extra tool to be used, not as a replacement for offline activism. Of course, these days, when many of us are locked in our rooms, that might be changing, but that was the view earlier on. There's a general regain in interest, it seemed, in joining political parties, and young people, because there were interviews over time as part of the project, actually we could measure that there was a regain in interest in also voting, which has perhaps played out in recent elections in many European countries. Here's some photos of people who were involved in the project. So this is a riders collective of delivery riders in Madrid, young people who set up an alternative cooperative delivery system. These are young people involved in refugee rescues, so just some reminders of some of the ways that young people are doing politics. But based on the analysis of 4,500 youth or youth-led organizations, it was striking that very few of them, less than 20%, made any mention of having a political mission or doing political activity, even when those organizations are arguably doing political things, like campaigning for the environment, for example. And so this would seem to suggest, and that was a contrast with the way that some of the people who participate in those organizations understand their activity. So you would have a situation where the organization wouldn't be making any political claim as a political claim, but the young people would understand themselves to some extent as doing something political by, for example, planting trees in their neighborhood. So there was a kind of gap between the way young people understood themselves as doing politics and the way organizations, youth-led organizations and youth-focused organizations would describe themselves. And this is perhaps something worth thinking about in terms of the way we understand politics in society as a whole. I think there's a general confusion between political activity and party political activity. And perhaps also because of this confusion, many organizations are reluctant to call themselves political for fear of appearing party political. And indeed, in some countries, there's also legal restrictions on them calling themselves political, and they can lose non-profit status and other kinds of statuses if they do that. But this is something that is adding to a kind of confusion and potentially leading to young people not understanding that what they are doing is politics. It may not be party politics, but it is politics. So this is something worth further reflection on. Something that was mentioned yesterday, which also came out very strongly from the biographical interviews, was that the lack of public spaces for young people to gather in is really a crucial issue, and that many different kinds of people are aware of it, young people themselves, but also notably people in city administrations and people in youth organizations. All of them mentioned that the privatization and the increasing control of public space was posing major issues and barriers to the overall socialization of young people, but particularly their political participation. Now, some people have done something about that and have claimed alternative spaces for themselves. That's not necessarily something new, but it's something that is continuing, occupying disused buildings, claiming unused spaces in the city is perhaps something that youth work wants to reflect on. An example of that is a popular gym in Rome, which set itself up as an alternative to the very expensive gyms that existed nearby, in which people said, well, we simply can't afford to go to, and that means that young people end up hanging out and potentially getting in trouble rather than involving in sports. And when they get involved in sports at this particular gym, as you can see from the graffiti, they also get a kind of political education of a certain kind, but anti-racist values there. Something coming out of the large surveys that were done, which is perhaps no surprise, but is important to underline, is that in some countries, there was a dangerously low level of commitment to democracy. When one asked, is democracy the best system? In the 9 countries involved, people over the age of 35 were almost entirely, like 98%, strongly in favor of democracy as the best system of government. But when you went under the age of 35, that was getting much more shaky. And in some countries was particularly concerning, including France, country I am in. And what was interesting, perhaps, is that the 18 to 24-year-old section were more enthusiastic about democracy or more committed to democracy than the 25 to 34 age group. And that perhaps shows the ongoing scarring that comes from living through an economic crisis. The 25 to 34-year-old group was likely to have been coming out of education, starting to find a job when the 2008 financial crisis started. And that has its economic effects, but it also perhaps has its psychological effects in terms of attitudes towards democracy. And I think as we're going through this COVID crisis, that is something that we need to really bear in mind. And so perhaps it means that youth work needs to reflect even more on a differentiated strategy for different age groups. Something else that came out of surveys was that there is a kind of new struggle over women's rights amongst the youth. It was very striking that quite high percentages of young people under the age of 35 thought that abortion should not be allowed under any circumstances, a much higher percentage than in other age groups. Only in Spain was it the case of the 9 countries that the younger you are, the more likely you are to think that abortion is acceptable. In the other countries, the tendency was quite in the opposite direction. And again, in France, the situation was particularly concerning. You would have 13% of 18 to 24-year-olds, 9% of 25 to 34-year-olds in France thinking that abortion is always unacceptable, whereas anybody over the age of 35, only maybe 4% would hold that view. There's a huge difference. At the same time, there was evidence that many people are getting more involved in feminist groups, and there's a regain in interest in organizing for women and gender rights. So this is indications that there is a kind of struggle going on in the younger generations over these rights, and youth work perhaps need to think about how to empower women, both the young people it's working with, but also more broadly in the sector, to have female leadership in the sector. Both in the surveys and in the biographical interviews, again and again, we heard that from young people, they felt unprepared for taking part in democratic life in their countries and in Europe more widely. There was this sense of delegitimization, which wasn't present in the older generations. Now, that might be something about, maybe that's not something so new, but it's something that we need to take account of. And it ties up very much, in my mind, with some of the things we heard yesterday about having spaces backstage or off stage for young people to also gather their confidence and then go and participate, rather than feeling like they are always under a kind of examination. And this language of exams was quite present. They were afraid of making a mistake and being kind of constantly evaluated in their political participation. So this is something, a set of attitudes which maybe the youth work sector needs to take into account, thinking about how to partner up with schools where that's not already being done, but more generally trying to inspire a sense of confidence and entitlement to political voice, in addition to practical and theoretical knowledge about how to do this. Perhaps finally, in the analysis that was done of social media on Twitter and Facebook, the kind of discussions around the climate strike and about the Me Too movement and feminism more generally revealed that this was a great place of political struggle online, that social media is a new site of political struggle. And in some countries, the team was able to demonstrate the ways in which women organizing online, for example, were able to, in a certain sense, reclaim the space of the discussion over women's rights. In Spain, this was apparent, that through women supporting each other on Twitter, strategically retweeting and strategically engaging, they were able to reclaim the conversation which had been dominated by men and men who were not so supportive of women's rights. And so this picture of a space of struggle emerged, and also a space in which people were using political strategies to dominate the space. And so that would suggest that for youth work, we need to have a reflection and a kind of training on how young people engage politically online and strategically do this. There was every indication that many young people are already quite aware of how to do that, but this knowledge is almost certainly not spread equally in the population. So to conclude, and I was hearing Guy's claim that we shouldn't be all the time negative, there were extremely positive things that came out of the research. Here I list some of them in both the biographical and in the survey data. The youth generation, despite everything, was the most optimistic by far. The people who believe that it is possible to change things in society, believes in the need for politicians overwhelmingly, actually, in the survey data, and believes that it has the capacity to influence them. Despite the remarks about gender equality that I made, it's the generation that's most supportive of homosexual adoption and overall quite supportive of women's independence. and largely has this character of people wanting to get personally involved in an issue, and that perhaps is a kind of ideal of citizenship that should be celebrated. And so there's plenty of promises of renewal coming out of the research, which should give the youth work sector every sense of confidence going forward. So that's some of the results I've tried to summarize very quickly for you. Thanks very much.